Hey guys, this week my dad sat down with Sara Russell from RBC Capital and Clayton Mitchell from Thomas Jefferson. They talked all about capital planning for the future of the college campus, and a lot of unpopular things were said. We are all about keeping it real, and that makes this my favorite episode so far. You're gonna love it.
Will the traditional college campus even be relevant in the future? Today, it seems that everything in higher education is in question. Now, more than ever, it's important for us to have those tough conversations about what the future holds. Join me as I talk to the placemakers, those professionals who are in the business of making college campuses places where people want to be. Each week, we'll explore the future of the college campus in a very uncertain world. From the Collective Good Podcast, this is the Placemakers series by MSCU, and I'm your host, TJ Logan. And we are live. Welcome back, everybody. We're doing it one more time. Welcome to my favorite time of the week. It's when I get to hang out with my friends who are cooler and smarter than your friends and talk about the future of higher education. Today, our placemakers are Sara and Mitch, and we are talking about capital planning, strategic planning, the financial future of higher education. This episode's going to be phenomenal, and I've been excited about it all week. Thank you both for coming on the pod. I want to start out with, I got a little bit of a bee in my bonnet this week. There's been a really popular article that's been floating around from the President of Brown. And I think all in all, just as a disclaimer, the article's great. It talks about sort of how we get on track for the fall. And it's titled, it's something like higher education must come back in the fall. And again, how we get on track for the fall is fantastic. But I struggle a little bit with some of the premise there. And part of it is that we have a number of different institutions that are struggling financially and have been for a while. It's been a little bit thin. There's been a lot of pressure. And one of the things I struggle with is this notion of saving everything. I want the baby, but I don't necessarily want all the bathwater. And part of my question for you coming out of this is, should we really be trying to save all of higher education right now? Or should we be using this as a pivot point and moment in time to sort of innovate and think about what's relevant as we move forward? I know that's heavy. Cheers, cheers
Yeah.
to you both as we get started.
Definitely coming out hot out of the gates. But, I did read the article, and I think that there's a lot of good that comes with it. As a finance person, you do have to pay attention, and you do have to be concerned with this notion of saving everything, and institutions that are financially struggling. How do they come out of this successfully and in a smart way? We've been saying for a long time that the cost of higher education has gotten a little bit out of control. Student loan debt is just astronomical. Students are graduating from school with debt loads and salaries that they're never going to make enough money to pay back those student loans.
Right.
So how do we take a step back as an industry and say, higher education is an economic driver? It's an economic driver for students because they are bettering themselves and preparing themselves to go out into the world and to be contributing members of society. But it's also an economic driver for our economies, our local economies. And in many towns and cities, the universities and even small colleges are the economy. And without those students on campus, and without the faculty, and without people supporting local businesses, there's a huge decline in revenue and then job creation, not just in higher education, but in the larger economy. And so, I think we have to be careful. We have to be respectful that there are colleges that may be financially strapped. That doesn't mean they shouldn't reopen. But I do think it begs the question as to how do they look at their place in this world, how they can use their resources, and how they can make smart decisions to enroll students. Because the other thing you don't want to see, we are in an era where we have seen more consolidation and more closing of the small liberal arts colleges. How do you convince students to come to your institution knowing whether or not they're going to get a 4-year degree from you?
Yeah, and you and I briefly just chatted before this, and one of the things I said then was, yes, I think higher education is an economic driver. I think that's really, really important. But I would put the caveat in, it has to be an economic driver with relevance attached to it, right? If it can't just purely be that we're interested in economic drivers, because then we still have coal mining towns booming right now, but there wasn't a relevance piece there. So how do we find that relevance? An example is I had a conversation with a colleague earlier this week about, how many education schools do we need in the state of Ohio, or how many, whatever it is. And so thinking about how do we become relevant through this moment?
So I think I would agree. There's so much capital investment in our current educational infrastructure that unless we did it in a very planned and methodical way, I don't know that we could pivot really in the 3 to 4 months that we have before the start of the new year. I also think it's a credibility issue for public institutions. I mean, that's what they do on a year-by-year basis. And so from a credibility standpoint, from a structure standpoint, from an economic standpoint, it makes sense to move that forward. I think moving ahead, if we were thinking about a natural inflection point, and we talked about this before, this concept that I learned in the Navy of required operating capabilities and projected operating environments. And so we need to sort of think ahead 10 years from now, what should our education be doing? And what do we need to do today to begin that restructure? Because we have a lot of capital in terms of physical infrastructure. We are now moving into online in a very heavy way. I think COVID-19 is just going to make online that much more appealing for a lot more universities and things of that sort. But how do we craft an education environment that does all the things that we need? I talked about it in terms of helping me develop leadership skills in addition to what I learned in the classroom. I think the classroom is about a 5 to 10% part of that equation. Everything else, the social interactions, the leadership, all of those things, whether it's online or in on a physical campus, we've got to find a way to replicate that, and we've got to find a way to get to that next model of how we're going to educate people.
Right. I want to switch gears just a little bit and start talking about what we can't afford to continue doing. You know, we've had some conversations over the past couple of weeks about some of the stuff we have to stop doing. And you know, Mitch, as an example, you talked about the buildings and how, not necessarily that we have to stop having buildings or building buildings, but sort of how we purpose buildings. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
I think, you know, I'm caught up in this concept of utilization, right? So when you're deploying an asset and you're managing that asset, you want to try to get as much value as you can through that. Similar to what's happened with Uber and Airbnb and those types of concepts. And so I think this concept of shared sort of infrastructure, where the infrastructure is shared between universities, it might be shared between the university and the public. I use the example of a junior high school that has a gymnasium that's a community center after hours, and a library, a community library. And so those are ways that I think we get bang for the buck out of our infrastructure, not having facilities that are used, for a short, intense period of time, and then they, for the most part, go fallow for the rest of the week, if not the rest of the year.
And that's kind of been the model up till now, right? Is that we build these single-use facilities. And one of the things, Sarah, that you had said that really struck me as it relates to our facilities is this notion of understanding them, right? Like, so Mitch just talked about single-use facilities. You talked about facilities from a financial perspective at one point in terms of us as practitioners understanding how our facilities function, even in terms of which ones make money and don't.
Exactly. One of the things that you've talked about in other of your podcasts is this siloing in higher education that we see. And there are a lot of different silos in higher education, but there are clearly financial silos. And it's a structure that a lot of institutions have gone to try and understand what programs are making money, what auxiliaries are making money. And you do, I think, have to look at, if we've got this new $50 million building, and it's for the program in, I'm not even going to say a program, so I'm not offensive, but you've got a program and you've spent $50 million on this bright, shiny building, and your enrollment doesn't support that building. And now you've got debt and operating cost on it. How are you going to retrofit that building, or how are you going to convince the users that decided they needed this bright and shiny building, who aren't drawing the enrollment and the revenue that you need to sustain the building? How are you going to convince them to allow it to be used for some other function? And I think that this pandemic shows us that we do have to break down some of these silos to some degree so that we can operate institutions in a holistic way where people can appreciate we have to be budget minded and we have to know what programs and what facilities are giving us the greatest return on our investment. But at the same time, we have to appreciate that some of the programs that we're going to keep at these institutions are not going to be the big draw. They're not going to be College of Business, which tends to be a big draw, or it's not going to be something in the medical fields or things like that, where students tend to pay a little more for tuition and technology in their classrooms.
So can I piggyback off of that comment? If you look at the way that businesses sort of leverage their assets, academic institutions and hospitals tend to be the laggards in sort of understanding the asset utilization, the ROI that they're getting from all of their different spaces. So when you walk by a classroom and that classroom is not occupied, that's lost revenue. That's a lost revenue stream that you're not sort of taking advantage of. The same with gymnasiums and other components. And I think when education begins to to really look at its space as assets and manages it from an asset management base, there is the student at the center and getting educated, but increasingly we've got to reduce the cost of that, and that means that we've got to put less costs into our infrastructure at that possible, and become more efficient in how we use that infrastructure. And so until we really in an academic environment sort of create this ability to understand how we're getting an ROI from each investment that we're making,
right,
to deliver that education, I think we're going to have problems driving the cost of education down.
So that's an interesting framework, Mitch. When you think about, I'd never really thought of it that way, and probably guilty as most people are as practitioners. You walk by an academic building, and at night it's completely dead, and you can walk by the Union and it's alive, and vice versa. And so you start to see where you're losing opportunities on those assets. At the same time, institutions are pretty land rich generally. Certain institutions specifically, if you look at your land grant institutions, is it time from a financial strategy perspective or an operational effectiveness strategy for campuses to start thinking about being smaller, especially with the enrollment cliff that's right on top of us?
I think campuses have to look at what happened in retail with a lot of shopping centers. And so shopping centers are going through sort of a revitalization. I don't think they're going to totally disappear.
Right.
But certainly the big boxes are getting much smaller. And I think campuses are going to have to think about the same thing. There's a huge carrying cost to all of that infrastructure. And so, what's happening really across every academic institution is a significantly large deferred maintenance backlog that's just getting bigger and bigger. And it's just becoming a much more significant liability that, there are a lot of universities that are going to get crushed just by the cost of recapitalizing old infrastructure.
Yeah, the big box metaphor is a really interesting one and a really good one, because I think we've seen that, right? The internet has changed the way that retail functions and works, and higher ed's been a little bit resistant to that, and maybe it's time to come around to that. The other thing that we've been resistant to, and as I'm looking right at you, Sarah, is we've been, and maybe it's not, maybe it is resistant. We've been recession resistant, not recession proof, but recession resistant as an industry. Is this pandemic, is it any different? Does it force us to consider things a little differently? Or should we sit back and go, well, we're recession resistant as the economy continues to do what it does, and you're much better prepared to speak to that than I am, that we're in an okay position?
I don't think that we should rest on our laurels and feel comfort that thus far higher education has been recession resistant. I think that truly you can go back and you can look at the facts, and you can look at the economic crisis in 07, 08 and other periods of time where our economy has been in a recession, but we were not in a recession. We were not facing an economic downturn with a global health pandemic. And I think the challenge now, and I'm not saying that this is this doomsday, oh my gosh, we're going to have this plummeting higher education sector, but I think that a public health crisis of this nature drastically changes what students and their families are thinking about. And I do think there are a lot of students that want to be back on campus, that would prefer to be back on campus, that are not enjoying their foray into distance learning for any number of factors, engagement with their professors, the social aspects of being with friends.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we have to be cautious. The economy, we do tend to see people flock to institutions, back to higher education in times of recession, because they want to be either they're unemployed, they're underemployed, and they want to have a pivot point so that they can go out and be prepared in the world when the job market opens back up. And now I think that these social distancing measures that we have in place are really hindering people, and it's causing a lot of concern and fear. And until we really can grasp what is going to happen with enrollment this fall, not just enrollment, but enrollment this fall, and then what students are willing to pay for school in the fall, I don't think we're going to know the impact of this virus, in this notion of higher education being recession resistant.
Mm-hmm. So I want to go back to this idea of the whole campus, because we touched on it a little bit. It has been a thread running through all of our guests that we've had on the Placemakers, that everybody continues to talk about breaking down silos and working as a whole campus. And I suspect that that's more important right now than it's ever been before. Is there anything you would add to that in terms of thinking about as a whole campus, thinking about, again, there's always been this sort of territorialism in higher education, meaning, if I got the bookstore, that's my space, and you don't get to touch that space. Or if I've got this auxiliary, or I've got I don't know that the financial model supports auxiliaries doing for auxiliaries anymore, and non-auxiliaries doing for this, and RCM. I mean, does that all just sort of implode this territorialism in these silos?
I think, if you think about the stress that state, local, federal government have in terms of revenues and tax bases, that doesn't look like it's going to get any better anytime. I don't see how, the academic institution, and to an extent the healthcare institution, gets out without some investment of private equity. And so, these public-private partnerships, those types of models, where you have folks whose expertise is building, planning, design, operating, maintaining the infrastructure. And the question is, can infrastructure be maintained much more efficiently, driving down operating expense, sort of allowing reinvestment to go into other places through models like that? Or, is there some Hail Mary that's going to come, and all of a sudden we're going to get hit by, manna from heaven to recapitalize all this infrastructure? When I talk to my counterparts in this industry, it's still the same. The facility condition indices, those measures deferred maintenance as a comparative to the plant replacement value, they're in the 20 to 25% range, and getting worse. Everyone has a 10-year plan to try to reduce it, but COVID-19, Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, any of those things can knock the strongest of institutions off of their strategic plan.
Well, and Sarah, you'd know this better than anybody. If you were to prognosticate about the role of public-private partnerships in the future of higher education, what do you think? I mean, is that going to be just, are institutions backs against the wall, or is it the smarter, more strategic choice? Is it the institutions with the money that can bully their ways out? What do you think? What is the role of that?
Well, I think it's interesting because, the whole idea of public-private partnerships, the successful partnerships have not been tested by this type of event. And so we like to look at public-private partnerships. I think there's a misnomer often that these are sort of free money, and we're going to get, private partners to take away all of our problems, and we're going to fully transfer risk. And I do think that there are a great number of public-private partnerships that have been appropriately structured, and they do push those risks off, and universities have really been successful. And we've seen it not just in auxiliaries like housing and dining, but we've seen it with energy plants, we've seen it with parking, we've got increase for academic facilities. I think the real challenge for these institutions is what happens in an environment where you can no longer bring the customer to the campus. And if you're talking about a parking system that is reliant on parking revenues, and your P3 operator came in and offered you a structure because they think they're going to have X number of students park on campus over the course of a year. Well, what do those documents say if those students aren't showing up? You look at housing, you look at auxiliaries, you look at energy. How can we make sure that we build in the appropriate levels of risk transfer for these institutions, but while the institutions also have an understanding of what it means if they're shutting down operations because of a pandemic? And so I'll circle back to the article you kicked off with from the Brown Press.
Yeah.
Shutting down campuses every time we have this type of health crisis is not a sustainable future for higher education. And
Right.
whether that's a popular thing to say or not, I think that we do have to be mindful that there are going to be a variety of situations like this that come up. And maybe it's not every year, maybe it's once every 20 years, but how can we learn from this and create systems and have facilities and models in place so that we're not shutting down campus when some new disease or some new crisis faces us?
I think that's an outstanding point, because there's an interdependence that we have, just as part of the whole sort of structure or fabric of how commerce happens within the United States. And so we can't, for example, stock all the supplies that we need to get through a pandemic and things of that sort. We have a just-in-time delivery system. And so what I think has to happen is there needs to be this greater interdependence between government, business, public institutions, so that the left hand knows what the right hand's doing, and we have well thought game plans for dealing with pandemics and other disasters in the future. Because no academic institution, particularly on the private, a lot of the smaller private ones, are equipped and financed to be able to weather these types of storms on a consistent basis. However, if there's a timely action on behalf of government, business, and the public institutions to mitigate some of the impacts of these deals, then I think the system as a whole has a chance. We cannot afford not just a shutdown of academic institutions, but as we're starting to see across the board, commerce in general.
So, well, and first of all, Sarah, this show's all about saying unpopular things, so thanks for doing that. I'm curious then, you talk about public-private partnerships, and to my knowledge, I can't point to anything that's ever happened like this, right? The industry of higher education is about bringing people together, and this is the one instance I can point to that has taken that model and absolutely made it impossible for us to do our work in any assimilation of the way that we've always done it. Does that change the risk profile of higher education from a P3 perspective? Because it is all about transferring risk. It's so new and different. And I wonder, does that change the math at all?
Well, let me add one point. Sarah's exactly right. A public-private partnership isn't going to necessarily mean it's cheaper. It's just you may not have any other access to capital.
Sure.
And so it may be, you may be forced down that path.
I think we're really going to have to see how these situations unfold. I was talking to a client earlier today, and I've financed a lot of student housing and public-private partnerships. And one of the conversation points we were having has to do with, did universities really get the risk transfer that they thought they were going to get in their P3s? And the hope is that you would say yes. But the reality that we're seeing is that a lot of institutions are saying, yes, I have a P3 for this student housing project on my campus, but I need to make a policy decision on my campus with respect to my own residence halls. And because I'm going to make that decision, and because all of my students are equal, irrespective of whether they live in my owned housing or my public-private partnership housing, this is the decision that we're going to make. And I, as the institution, am now going to have to step up and support that public-private partnership in a way that I was not anticipating supporting it. They're not required to do it. They're making that decision for the best of their students. And so that is a decision that some institutions can afford to make. It's a decision many institutions won't be able to make. And I think that as we go forward in the P3 market, what we're going to be looking at is how can we make sure that we are structuring these partnerships in a way that we are being responsible and we are developing a model that can meet stress tests and crises that we have not thought about before.
Right.
At the same time, respecting that the university is using a P3 because they want some level of risk transfer. And how can we come together as an industry to make sure that at the end of the day, the university is not stuck with a deal or a transaction structure or holding the bag for refunds that they never thought that they were going to have. And, I think that there is going to be capital out there that is willing to support our institutions. There will be people looking for public-private partnership opportunities, but you better believe it's going to be much tougher for those institutions that have had enrollment struggles or are more financially strapped, because the public-private partners are going to say, and again, trying not to be unpopular, we don't want to throw good money after bad. And yes, we realize that there are schools that are constrained, and those are probably the schools that need us the most right now, but we need to see a long-term viability in that institution before we're willing to deploy our capital.
And do you think what I think of when you say that is one, there's this element in risk transfer that we never saw coming. It's almost like a triangular arbitrage, and this thing came in and changed the math for everybody, right? But also, I wonder if it goes back to this point that we continue to hear about leveraging our entire asset as a campus and spreading that risk out a little further. Will we see RFPs that are not for a single housing project anymore, but for a campus infrastructure project inclusive of classroom, parking, housing, food, a real holistic campus planning? Because what it does is it spreads that out a little bit more. I don't know if we'll begin to see that as well.
Or TJ, you may see models like in DC where 3 or 4 universities, partner in the same housing complex, right?
Right. Or the state of Georgia.
That's another great way to spread that risk. You partner with other universities. And I think it kind of gets to my point in terms of, the utilization of assets. If you got 4 or 5 entities that have come and sort of joined forces to do that, chances are the program that you have for those facilities is going to sort of result in a higher utilization rate than just one entity having the dormitory sitting on their particular campus and not being able to leverage those opportunities. And by the way, there's also academic opportunities to enhance the education of those students.
And that's a really interesting point, because not only are we in silos on our own campuses, we're in silos as an industry oftentimes. And there's a lot of redundancy in what we do. And that idea of spreading risk out amongst several campuses in a multi-campus RFP, as an example, is a really, really interesting idea. We always like to ask, what opportunities do you see? From a capital planning perspective, as we look down the road, I'm an opportunist. And so this thing is happening. It's a real challenge. We've all got to figure it out. But gosh, there's got to be some kind of opportunity that comes out of this. In your mind, what are the opportunities that we can capitalize on?
I think that, the most obvious one is, online education does have a place, and maybe it has a place even on a campus where, you're a resident campus, sort of discerning what that's going to be, I think is gonna have to sort of, take some more thought. I do believe that, if you're trying to become efficient and trying to, to me, it's about driving down your operating expenses over time. You can build all the pretty buildings you want, but if you don't have the cash stream to maintain those over time, then you're going to be challenged. So it's taking a really hard look at your existing infrastructure and really asking hard questions. Do I really need all of this? And is there an opportunity for me to combine programs and do other things to more efficiently, use a smaller footprint going forward? And that's kind of anathema to philanthropy and things of that sort. Everybody wants to build a big building. Everybody wants, sort of to have their own space. But we're getting to this place really quick, I think, where we're going to have to make hard decisions. Is it about the space, or is it about creating this educational opportunity? And by the way, what we talked about last week, maybe it's not the same model we've been using for the past 75 years.
Right.
Industrialized model for how we deliver education. Our education, and no offense to to folks in general, but it's geared to make factory workers. It's geared for an assembly line type of of deal. And we're moving into a knowledge, thought-based society. It's probably safe to say that a lot of our academic institutions haven't made that jump, especially if you read books like The New Education by Kathy Davidson.
Yeah. Well, and that, my friend, is the bathwater I'd like to get rid of. Sarah, what about you? Opportunities. What do you think?
Well, I like wanted to jump in like 12 times because I think that's
interrupt. This is a
really
conversation.
great thing. And I think that, this whole situation is the opportunity for universities and colleges to hit the pause button and say, we have been cobbling together short-term solutions for a very long time to some very big problems, whether that's deferred maintenance, whether that is plummeting enrollment, whether that's just the fact that we've got a lot of segments of this country where we have declining high school enrollment. We've been throwing money at, well, let's buy this list, let's buy that list, let's market ourselves this way, let's put up a billboard right next to our competitor college and see if we can steal their enrollment. I think this is almost the breath of fresh air that an institution needs to say, throw that out the window. We have got to stop. We have got to see, what are we good at? What is the state of our current facilities? And how can we combine what we have with what our mission is, where we want our focus to be, and where we realistically think we can be successful in drawing students? And then you can start to put together a capital planning model. And that capital planning model has to be holistic. It's got to look at everything. It's got to look at P3s. It's got to look at university debt. But it's like you were talking about, TJ. It's not an RFP for one academic building on this side of campus, followed by a year later another RFP for this student housing. It's got to be more planned, and it has to be long-term fixes and not band-aids over problems.
TJ, one point there to echo Sarah's point. Form has to follow function. So if we don't put any thought to what the function's gonna be, it's gonna be very difficult to put together a capital planning model to deliver that.
Well, we said this the other day, right? If I were to imagine a college campus today, it might be very different than the realities that we live on. And this notion, Sarah, of sort of futures forecasting and thinking about outcomes driven. What is it we're trying to achieve? What do we have in the bank right now in terms of our facilities and our assets? And how do we take that as a foundation to move forward? I think that's absolutely brilliant. Well, I say it every week. No podcast is good after 30 minutes. And this one's no different. Although the two of you are absolutely brilliant. And I think I could talk to you all night. I want to thank you both for being here. Next week, we're going to be talking hospitality and the future of hospitality on college campuses. All those other people that are not students that we bring in. For now, we just want to say thank you and have a great afternoon.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you.
If there is anything we are learning during this quarantine, it's that content is king. Whether you're a higher ed pro who wants to start a podcast or a private student housing company who wants to host a webinar or virtual event, you want to do it with high quality. You want to align your brand with high quality audio, video, and stream live events that your customers deserve. Do what I did. Turn to our friends at Duo Studios. These guys can do it all. From streaming esports to hosting live events and making podcasting simple enough even I can do it. Make Duo Studios your partner in producing high quality content. Visit them today for a consult at duostudios.org/placemakers. That's Duo Studios, DUO Studios.org/placemakers.